Hey guys, welcome back. And this week we're going to do something a little bit different and take a look at some of the best Super NES games on the Switch that hardly anyone ever talks about. While the Switch does have a ton of great Nintendo heavy hitters like Super Metroid and Donkey Kong Country in its Super NES library, there's a whole bunch of other really neat games that are well worth your time. You just may not even know they exist thanks to Nintendo's not so great way of organizing them. So let's get this video started with a beat 'em up that finished up a trilogy of mostly solid games. The Peacekeepers for the Super NES is a pretty awesome beat-em-up that just never got the attention that it deserved. This is actually the third in a trilogy of beat-em-ups by Jaleco that started with the not-so-great Rival Turf on the Super NES, which is only really notable for its so embarrassing that it's good box art. This was followed up by Brawl Brothers, and that's a game that definitely came home with me a lot from the video store. Oh, and just a little bit of trivia, Brawl Brothers was actually the very first review that I did on this channel nearly 10 years ago. But the final game in the series is The Peacekeepers, and well, we probably need to talk a little bit more about that one. First off, you can't talk about The Peacekeepers without mentioning the absolute insane amount of story in this one. Someone at Jaleco really wanted to tell you a story in this game, which, may I remind you, is a beat-em-up, a game that usually doesn't feature story-heavy moments simply because these games are just all about jumping in and beating people up. You generally don't want to sit around and read minutes worth of text just to move forward in these kinds of games. It doesn't help that the story is also pretty badly translated, with a lot of it being just unintentionally hilarious. So unless you're into drunkenly laughing at bad translations in video games, get ready to skip a lot of plot text in this one. Once you get past that though, you're left with a pretty decent beat 'em up. Of course, you get to pick from a ragtag group of heroes with each one playing surprisingly different from each other. Flynn's your totally standard guy that isn't too weak, isn't too strong, and isn't too fast, but he is perfectly good at beating dudes up. Echo's the girl that can do cool jump kicks and stuff, because, I mean, that's what girls in video games do. Al's kind of the muscle with some of the slower moves, though he kind of just looks like he wandered out of a Walmart hunting section. And finally, Pro Cop is here to be the most annoying of the bunch, since his standard attacks are so slow that enemies can actually hit you in the middle of a combo. At least he does have this cool fire-breathing move that can clear the area, and he also gets up off the floor like The Undertaker, so I mean, I guess that's kind of cool. The branching stages are also pretty neat, letting you choose completely different paths through some of the stages, which definitely helps mix things up on multiple playthroughs, since depending on which path you choose, you can have a very different experience each time you play. Besides all of that though, this is still your pretty standard brawler. But standard or not, The Peacekeepers is still the best of the bunch when it comes to this trilogy, and it's an awesome addition to the Switch library. It's a lot of fun just to grab a friend and mindlessly beat your way through the game. Oh wait, I'm sorry, peacekeep your way through the game. There's enough variety in the stages and the enemies to keep it from getting too stale, and no stage seems to go on longer than it should, which is a big deal in a beat-em-up game. About the only real complaint that I have with the game besides the plot elements is that there's no music in the game by default. Yes, if you want to listen to music in The Peacekeepers, you actually need to go into the menu before you start the game and turn the music on, unless you just want to peacekeep in silence. And I mean, who wants to really do that in a beat 'em up? But if you're paying for Switch Online and haven't played The Peacekeepers yet, then do us Rush It and Beat Trilogy fans proud by keeping the peace with this awesome Super NES brawler. The Ignition Factor for the Super NES is one of the most unique games on the Switch Super NES library. In the previous video, I mentioned how The Fireman was the definitive fireman-based action game on the Super NES, and I still think it definitely is. But where The Fireman was all about bombastic action movie set pieces and dialogue, The Ignition Factor goes in a completely different direction, with a game that's closer to a strategy game than an action game. You can definitely see that things are going to be a little bit different as soon as you start the game and are greeted with a full-on briefing of the fire that you're about to deal with. You'll be given a rundown of the situation, including the different types of dangers that you may come across, and the time limit that you'll have to get the job done. After that, you'll be taken into an inventory screen where you'll need to select different tools for the job, but you can't take everything or you'll be slowed to a crawl. You can even select which entrance you'd like your fire truck to drop you off at, and I just think that's pretty neat. And if you're thinking that all of this sounds like a lot for a game that's based around putting out fires, well, I mean, you're right. But I love this kind of planning before a mission starts in a game. It really gets you invested in the mission that you're about to do. Speaking of that mission, you'll be dropped off at the entrance that you chose, and then it's up to you to make your way through each building to save the survivors before the time runs out. You do get a basic map showing where survivors are, but getting through the maze-like areas is the main challenge of the game. The fire itself is more of just like an inconvenience than anything, since your main challenge is to find the survivors and get out before the time runs out. To do so, you'll need to use your items you choose before the mission to make your way through to get them. Navigating things like blocked doors that need to be knocked down with your axe, or blown up with explosives, or even different types of fires that require different tanks to extinguish. Thankfully, if you happen to bring the wrong stuff in the briefing, there's usually another firefighter just kinda standing around to let you switch some stuff out. The survivors themselves can also be a hassle, with some of them having special requests before they allow you to not let them die in a fire. Plus, there's even side missions for you to do so you can access certain areas that you couldn't get to before. It's definitely a lot to deal with, but it really comes together in an incredibly addictive game if you're into planning and executing a strategy to get through all of this. Especially since bad planning will ultimately lead to you just running out of time or just burning to death on the floor. And if all that sounds like your kind of thing, then give Ignition Factor a chance on the Switch. This is a great addition to the Super NES library, and one that can offer a ton of replayability if you want to try to get all the survivors in each run. It's a really unique game, and it's definitely the only fireman simulator on the system that I know of. But I will admit that it's probably not for everyone. The planning aspect and slower pace of the game definitely isn't going to be your thing if you're expecting more of an action game. And if you want that, then you can just go play the fireman. But if the slower paced, more strategic game sounds like that's your thing, then definitely check out the Ignition Factor on the Switch. Joe and Mac 2 for the Super NES is a great sequel that maybe waited a little bit too long to come out originally. Obviously, the original Joe and Mac is an all-time classic with its crazy caveman platforming adventures, especially when it hit the Super NES back in 1991. The large character sprites and awesome prehistoric setting really showed off what the Super NES was capable of in its early years. Of course, any game that does that well is gonna get a sequel, and a few years later, we finally got Joe and Mac 2. And this one is definitely more Joe and Mac. Shocking, I know. But that's not really a bad thing. You play as Joe and or Mac as you make your way through multiple levels that span every video game level stereotype that you can imagine. Like the forest level and the fire level. All kidding aside though, these derivative levels usually have at least one cool section that has you doing stuff like running from massive dinosaurs or even barely dodging a lava flow in the belly of a volcano. There's even usually a rideable dinosaur in each stage that lets you stomp or fly around the level while you're on its back. Though it usually doesn't last too long, since like one hit will send your dino friend to the grave. Still, it's pretty cool stuff, and every level at least feels unique, even though they all seem to come from Video Game Blueprint document number 367. Besides the levels though, not much else has changed in the gameplay department, besides Joe and Mac getting a lot of stuff that they can just eat this time around. At first you may think that they're just health pickups, which they are, but each one gives you a unique spitting ability, like being able to spit bones if you eat a piece of meat, or even being able to put out fires if you gulp a bunch of water down. It's nothing game-changing, but it is fun to take cavemen out by spitting stuff at them. Especially since everything seems to take way more hits this time than the first game did. The biggest reason that Joe and Mac 2 fell by the wayside when it first came out wasn't because it was a bad game, but more because it took a full 3 years to come out. And that was an eternity back then for a sequel to hit shelves if your name wasn't Squaresoft or Enix. By the time Joe and Mac 2 finally came out, no one really seemed to care, which is understandable due to just the sheer number of platform games already littering store shelves by then. So if you're like a lot of kids that missed out on Joe and Mac 2 when it first released, you've now got a chance these days to play a really fun platformer on the Switch. I still think it's a really solid game with a lot of character and humor to it, and this is also another great co-op game as well. So if you're one of those lucky people that has, friends, grab one and beat some cavemen up together. It may not be the most unique or genre-defining game on the Switch Super NES library, but Joe and Mac 2 is still a great dino-bashing time, even if it was never quite as popular as the first game was. Wild Guns for the Super NES is an incredible gem of a game that hardly anyone ever mentions anymore. Wild Guns was one of those games that was released kinda late in the Super NES's lifespan, with little fanfare around it. It just kinda showed up one day with barely any previews in magazines for it. And it's a real shame because this is one of the best games on the system. Basically, if you ever played anything like G.I. Joe in the arcade, then I think you know what you're getting here. Wild Guns is essentially a shooting gallery type game, where you can move your character left and right while lining up your cursor to shoot enemies spawning all over the background. The real challenge comes in trying to keep track of all the enemies spawning in, and prioritizing which ones to take out first, and making sure you're dodging their attacks by using your dodge. It sounds simple, but it can get hectic really quick if you let things get out of hand. Though you do have some more powerful weapons that you can shoot and pick up that can even the odds against the masses a bit. Each stage has multiple sections that you need to make it through to progress, with each one featuring some very different challenges. From larger open area stages where it seems like enemies are coming at you from everywhere, to smaller, more compact areas where the danger is just how fast you can dodge. You even get the classic Western level where you're protecting a train, and it's just as cool here as it is in the movies. What really sets Wild Guns apart though is its presentation. While you may immediately be able to tell that this is a Western themed game, which was almost non-existent back then by itself, it's also got this weird sci-fi steampunk thing going for it that just really blew me away back in the day. Everything looks like it's been cobbled together using weird machinery with full-on robots interacting with characters and settings straight out of a Western. Natsume did an incredible job with this one, making what could arguably be one of the best looking games on the Super NES. Even coming back to it for this video, I couldn't believe how well this game still holds up. It just looks incredible. And if you're like me and just a fan of pixel art in general, then please check Wild Guns out just for the graphics alone. This is a masterclass in that area. When I saw Wild Guns was announced for the Nintendo Switch Online, I was so happy that this one could finally maybe get the attention that it deserved. It's still a blast to play today, and I totally recommend you check it out, except for the fact that Wild Guns got an even better remaster on the Switch already, with Wild Guns Reloaded. And honestly, I think that's probably the version that you should play. It takes everything that's great about Wild Guns and remasters it beautifully for modern TVs. Wild Guns already looked spectacular on the Super NES, but seeing it in 1080p with widescreen support makes it feel like it was made for this. But if you still want to check out the OG on NSO, then by all means do so. It's still super fun and one of the best co-op games on the service. But no matter which version you decide to play, I can guarantee that you'll have a rootin' tootin' good time with this futuristic Western shooting gallery. And that's going to do it for this week, guys. I remember being really excited when Nintendo announced that they were going to bring back classic games on the Switch. But that excitement quickly went away when I saw that they were drip feeding those games to us over the course of months rather than weeks, especially for a service that we're paying for. Thankfully, since the Switch has been around for like nearly a decade at this point, it's amassed a pretty decent library of classic games, especially on the Super NES. So it's always exciting to see new people come along and experience these games who either don't want to deal with old consoles or just emulation in general. And I think that's awesome, even if the library could and should be much larger by now. But what about you guys though? Do you have any favorites on the Switch retro library? Well, let me know in the comments, since I'm sure I'll probably do another one of these videos in the future. But as for this video, well, I think that's gonna do it. Be sure to do that thumbs up thing for it if you happen to like it, or even a sub if you just can't get enough of my incredibly irritating voice. As for me though, I'll be back next week with some more games to talk about. Until then, get those Switch 2 pre-orders in ASAP, kiddos.